The legacy of Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris stood at his grand office window, overlooking the pristine neighborhood he had built from the ground up. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the manicured lawns, elegant homes, and neatly paved roads, each one a testament to his success. He clasped his hands behind his back, inhaling deeply as a sense of pride swelled within him. This was his empire, his legacy. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. His assistant, Margaret, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an ever-present clipboard, stepped in. "The new rental applications are on your desk, Mr. Harris. Quite a few good candidates this time." He turned, nodding as he moved toward his desk. "Thank you, Margaret. Anything I should be concerned about?" Margaret hesitated. "There's one that stands out. The Thompson family. Good income, stable jobs, 4 children. 4 children." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like potential noise complaints waiting to happen." She pursed her lips but continued. "They have excellent references from previous landlords. No record of issues. Very responsible." "Responsible isn't enough," he muttered, settling into his chair and flipping through the applications. His eyes quickly landed on the one she mentioned. "Robert and Lisa Thompson," he read aloud, glancing at the attached photograph. A smiling family stared back at him. A man with strong features and a kind gaze, a woman with intelligent eyes, and 4 boys, all bright-eyed and happy. His jaw clenched. "They're not the right fit," he said firmly, setting their application aside. "Next." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, are you sure? They seem—" "I said no," he interrupted. His voice was calm, but firm. "This community has a certain character. I intend to keep it that way." Margaret exhaled through her nose, biting her tongue. "Very well," she said, collecting the paperwork. As she left, Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had worked too hard to build this neighborhood into an exclusive high-standard area. He had seen what happened when the wrong people moved in. Property values dropped, conflicts arose, and soon the community lost its appeal. He wasn't about to let that happen here. He glanced back at the Thompson application. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up and slid it into the rejection pile. It wasn't personal. It was business. Or so he told himself. A family's dream. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment across town, Robert and Lisa Thompson sat at their kitchen table, excitement dancing in their eyes. Their 4 sons, Ethan, 14, Noah, 12, Jacob, 9, and Caleb, 6, gathered around, listening eagerly. "This new house could be a fresh start for us," Robert said, spreading the rental documents before them. "It's in a great neighborhood, close to your schools, and has enough space for everyone." Lisa squeezed his hand. "Imagine it, boys. Your own rooms, a backyard, maybe even a dog." The children lit up. "A dog?" Caleb gasped. "We'll see," Robert chuckled. "First, we need to get approved." Ethan, the eldest, looked at the paperwork with a serious expression. "Dad, what if they say no?" Lisa met Robert's gaze, sensing his hesitation. She knew what her husband was thinking. They had faced rejection before, but they had always kept pushing forward. "We have great credit, stable jobs, and a history of being good tenants," Lisa reassured them. "There's no reason they should reject us." "We'll just have to wait and see," Robert added. They submitted the application, their hearts hopeful, unaware of the silent barriers waiting for them. The letter that changed everything. Days later, Robert sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope in his hands. His heart pounded as he ran his thumb along the seal. Lisa sat beside him, the boys watching in anticipation. "Well?" she prompted gently. He took a deep breath and tore it open. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, we regret to inform you that your application has not been approved. Due to concerns about potential overcrowding and noise levels, we have selected another tenant. Sincerely, Harris Property Management. Robert's jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the letter again, searching for a real reason. Their finances were solid, their references impeccable. The excuses about noise and overcrowding felt hollow. Lisa placed a hand over his. "It's not right," she whispered. Robert exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check for the boys. "We'll find another place," he said. "But Dad," Noah protested. "They said no for a dumb reason. They don't even know us." Ethan frowned. "What if it's because we're black?" Lisa's heart clenched. She had hoped to shield them from this reality for a little longer. But Ethan was too perceptive, too smart. "Sometimes people make decisions based on things that have nothing to do with who you really are," Robert said carefully. "It's not fair, but we won't let it stop us." Caleb climbed onto Lisa's lap, his little hands curling around her arm. "Can we still get a new house?" Lisa pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Yes, baby. We'll make sure of it." Robert straightened, determination settling in his chest. "If we can't rent," he said, "we'll build." Lisa's eyes widened. "Robert." He met her gaze, fire in his eyes. "I have savings. We can buy land and build our own home. One that belongs to us, where no one can tell us we don't belong." The boy's eyes widened in excitement. "We can help," Jacob declared. Lisa studied her husband, her heart swelling with admiration. This was why she had fallen in love with him. His resilience, his drive, his refusal to let anything stand in their way. She nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The family huddled together, their disappointment turning into something new, something stronger. Hope. A son's discovery. While the Thompsons prepared for their new journey, another storm brewed in the Harris household. Mark Harris, Mr. Harris's 25-year-old son, had just started his new job at Elite Motors, a high-end car company. He was eager to prove himself, without relying on his father's reputation. He quickly fell in love with the work environment. Unlike the corporate world his father had built, Elite Motors had a different energy, a warmth, a camaraderie. And it all stemmed from the owners, Robert and Lisa Thompson. Mark was amazed by them. Robert treated every employee with kindness and respect, from the janitor to top executives. Lisa often visited, checking on employees, ensuring everyone felt valued. One day, Mark found himself in Robert's office, discussing future projects. As they talked, Mark noticed a framed family photo on Robert's desk. His heart nearly stopped. He recognized the faces immediately. "Is this your family?" Mark asked, his voice uncertain. Robert smiled. "Yes, my wife and our 4 boys." Mark felt dizzy. His father had spoken about rejecting an application recently, emphasizing the importance of keeping the neighborhood's character. And now, here he was, unknowingly working for the very man his father had dismissed. His stomach twisted. He had to tell this father. But he had no idea that what he was about to reveal would shake his father's world to its core. A son's awakening. Mark Harris drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. His heart pounded as he replayed his conversation with Robert Thompson over and over in his mind. His father, the man who had raised him to believe in ambition, order, and exclusivity, had rejected this family. The very same family that had built Elite Motors into one of the most respected companies in the city. Mark felt like he had just stepped into a paradox. His father always preached about success, about integrity, about how hard work paid off. But here was Robert Thompson, a man who embodied all of those things, and yet his father had denied him a home simply because of his skin color. Mark pulled into the long driveway of the Harris estate, his father's massive house looming over him like a judgmental sentinel. The grand columns, the stone driveway, the sprawling lawn. Everything about this place screamed wealth and exclusivity. Yet, for the first time, it felt suffocating. As he stepped inside, the scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filled his nose. He found his father sitting in the luxurious study, sipping whiskey in his favorite leather chair, a book resting on his lap. "Mark," Mr. Harris greeted, glancing up. "You're home late." Mark swallowed hard, stepping forward. "Dad, we need to talk." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." Mark hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Dad, I met Robert Thompson today." Mr. Harris' expression remained neutral, but Mark noticed the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "Oh, he owns Elite Motors." Mark let that information sink in, watching his father's reaction closely. Mr. Harris took another sip of his whiskey. "Is that so?" Mark clenched his fists. "You knew, didn't you?" A pause. Then, "I had my suspicions." Mark's stomach twisted. "Dad, do you have any idea what kind of man Robert Thompson is? He's incredible. He built that company from nothing. He treats his employees like family. His wife, Lisa, is just as impressive. Their 4 boys are intelligent, kind, and well-mannered. They're everything you claim to respect." Mr. Harris didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "Why did you reject their application?" Mark pressed, his voice rising. "You said it was about keeping the neighborhood's character. But that's not true, is it?" Mr. Harris finally set his drink down with a slow sigh. "Mark, you wouldn't understand." "No, Dad, I do understand," Mark shot back. "I understand that you let prejudice decide for you. I understand that you turned away a good family because of their skin color." His father's face hardened. "That's enough, Mark." "No, it's not enough." Mark's frustration boiled over. "I sat in Robert Thompson's office today, and I saw something I'd never seen in you, Dad. Respect. People admire him, not because of his money or power, but because of the kind of man he is. He's built something real, something meaningful. And you," Mark's voice broke, "you denied him a place to live. You turned away his family without even giving them a chance." The silence between them stretched. Mr. Harris exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "I did what I thought was best for the community, Mark." "No," Mark said, shaking his head. "You did what was best for yourself." His father flinched. "I looked up to you, Dad," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were a man of principle. But now, I'm not sure." Mr. Harris looked away, his fingers tightening around his glass. Mark had never seen his father look so small. With one last shake of his head, Mark turned and walked out of the study. For the first time in his life, he wasn't proud to be his father's son. A family's determination. Across town, Robert and Lisa Thompson sat on the front porch of their modest rental home, sipping coffee under the dim glow of the porch light. The rejection letter still sat on the table between them, its words cutting deep. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa asked, searching Robert's face. "Building our own home won't be easy." Robert exhaled, his eyes fixed on the empty lot they had just purchased earlier that day. "I'm sure," he said. "I refuse to let someone else decide where our family belongs." Lisa reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "We'll have to do a lot of the work ourselves." "I know," Robert murmured, "but we'll do it together." A soft rustling sound caught their attention. Turning, they saw their 4 boys standing in the doorway, their faces lit with excitement. "Are we really gonna build our own house?" Ethan, the eldest, asked. Robert smiled. "We are." Noah pumped his fist. "Yes, can I help with the walls?" Lisa laughed. "Let's start with something simple, like measuring first." Jacob grinned. "I can do that." Little Caleb climbed onto Lisa's lap. "Will there be room for a treehouse?" Robert chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "We'll see, little man." The family huddled close, their hearts brimming with determination. They had been denied a house, but they would build a home. Mr. Harris doubts. Back at the Harris estate, Mr. Harris sat in his dimly lit study, staring at the Thompson family's rejected application. The smiling photo of Robert and Lisa, their arms wrapped around their sons, haunted him. For the first time in years, Doubt crept into his mind. He had built his fortune on careful decisions, on maintaining exclusivity. But as he sat there, sipping his whiskey, he couldn't shake Mark's words. "They're everything you claim to respect." Mr. Harris sighed heavily, rubbing his face. Had he been wrong? He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, something in him whispered, yes. He wasn't sure what to do with that realization yet, but for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it. Foundations of change. The scent of sawdust filled the crisp morning air as Robert Thompson stood at the edge of the empty lot, a blueprint spread across the hood of his truck. The sun had barely risen, but he and Lisa had been up for hours, going over their plan again and again. "This is really happening," Lisa whispered, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. Robert exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. "It is. No turning back now." Lisa studied his face. There was exhaustion in his eyes, but beneath it, an unwavering resolve. "You still think we're crazy?" Robert teased, giving her a sideways glance. She smiled, wrapping her arms around his waist. "A little," she admitted, "but the best kind of crazy." Robert chuckled and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Then let's get to work." The sound of tires crunching on gravel caught their attention. Their 4 sons piled out of the car, dressed in oversized work gloves and old sneakers. Ethan carried a measuring tape like a sword, while Noah balanced a clipboard under one arm. "All right, team," Robert called, grinning. "Today, we measure and clear the land. We can't build a house on a jungle." Caleb, the youngest, pouted. "But I like the jungle." Lisa laughed, kneeling beside him. "Don't worry, baby. We'll plant a garden when the house is done." With renewed excitement, the boys scattered, helping their parents mark the boundaries of their future home. For Robert, every measured step was more than just a number. It was a declaration, a promise. They weren't just building a house. They were building their legacy. A son's struggle. Mark Harris sat in the sleek break room of Elite Motors, staring blankly at his untouched coffee. The usual hum of conversation and clatter of dishes felt distant. His mind was elsewhere, trapped between the world he grew up in and the world he was now discovering. The Thompson family story had rattled him. His father's prejudice had disappointed him. And yet, he still loved his father. "Something on your mind?" Mark looked up to see Robert Thompson leaning against the counter, a knowing look on his face. Mark hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. It's complicated." Robert took a seat across from him, folding his hands. Complicated is usually worth figuring out. Mark studied the man before him, the man his father had dismissed. Robert was successful, respected, admired, a self-made businessman, and yet his father had seen him as unworthy. "You ever had to question the way you were raised?" Mark asked suddenly. Robert considered the question. "Yes," he admitted, "more than once." Mark leaned forward. "What did you do?" Robert sighed, rubbing his chin. "I listened. I challenged what didn't sit right with me. And when I realized I needed to change, I did." Mark swallowed hard. "And what if it's your own father you're questioning?" Robert held his gaze. "Then it's even more important that you listen." Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe his father could change. But what if he wouldn't? Breaking the silence. That evening, Mark returned home with a heavy heart. His father was in the study again, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the fireplace. Mark hesitated in the doorway. "Dad," he started. Mr. Harris turned, his face unreadable. "I need you to come with me tomorrow," Mark said, stepping forward. "There's something I want you to see." His father frowned. "See what?" Mark swallowed. "The Thompsons." Mr. Harris stiffened. Mark pressed on. "You made a mistake, Dad. And I think you know it. But you won't understand unless you see who they really are." A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Mr. Harris exhaled. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. The invitation. The next morning, Robert wiped sweat from his brow as he stepped back from the foundation markers. The lot was taking shape. They had cleared the land, measured the layout, and mapped out where their home would stand. He had just set down his tools when he saw the car approaching. Lisa stepped beside him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Is that Mark?" Robert squinted. Sure enough, Mark Harris was stepping out of his car. And behind him, Robert's stomach tensed. "Mr. Harris." Lisa's fingers curled around Robert's. "Do you think?" "I don't know," Robert murmured. Mark approached first, his expression careful. "Hey, Robert." "Mark," Robert greeted, nodding. His eyes flickered to the older man standing a few feet back. Mark turned, gesturing toward his father. "This is my dad, Thomas Harris." The air felt charged with something unspoken. Mr. Harris met Robert's gaze, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he extended a hand. Robert hesitated only a second before shaking it. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. Harris said, his voice lower than usual. "I hear you're building a house." Robert studied him. "We are." A pause. Then Mr. Harris glanced around, taking in the wooden stakes and freshly cleared ground. "You're doing it yourself?" Robert nodded. "My wife and I. Our boys too. It's a family effort." Something flickered in Mr. Harris's eyes. Mark stepped in. "Dad, why don't you help today?" Mr. Harris stiffened. "Help?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "You know how to work a hammer, Mr. Harris." The challenge was clear. For a long moment, Mr. Harris didn't move. Then, with a long sigh, he removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "Hand me a hammer." Lisa's mouth parted in shock. Even Mark looked surprised. Robert smirked, handing him a hammer. "All right, Mr. Harris. Let's see what you've got." And for the first time, Mr. Harris picked up a tool not to build a business, but to build a home he once denied. A lesson in humility. As the sun climbed higher, Mr. Harris found himself sweating more than he had in years. His hands, soft from decades of desk work, quickly grew sore from gripping the hammer. He had never done manual labor like this, never built something from the ground up with his own hands. And yet, as the hours passed, something shifted inside him. He watched Robert work, steady, skilled, efficient. He watched Lisa haul wooden planks, her strength and determination evident. He saw Ethan and Noah measuring with precision, Jacob double-checking numbers, and little Caleb dragging twigs out of the way with all the seriousness of a foreman. This family, the one he had rejected, wasn't just hardworking. They were extraordinary. At one point, Robert handed him a water bottle. "Tired yet, Mr. Harris?" Mr. Harris chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "You're trying to kill me, Thompson." Robert smirked. "Not yet." They both laughed. And for the first time in years, Mr. Harris felt something he hadn't in a long time. Respect. For the Thompsons, for their journey, and slowly, for himself. As the sun began to set, he looked at Mark, exhaustion settling into his bones. "I was wrong," Mr. Harris admitted softly. "About them." Mark clapped his father on the back. "I know, Dad. That's why I brought you here." And as Mr. Harris looked at the family he once refused, he realized, for the first time, he wanted to be part of their story. A man rebuilt. Mr. Harris had never felt exhaustion like this before. His hands were raw, his back ached in ways he never thought possible, and sweat had soaked through his expensive button-down shirt. He wasn't built for labor, but he had forced himself to keep up, hammering nails, hauling wood, and clearing debris alongside the Thompson family. And yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet, something stirred inside him. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Fulfillment. It was strange, really. He had spent decades building an empire, acquiring properties, signing deals, and sitting in meetings that decided the fate of neighborhoods. And yet here, covered in dirt and sweat, working beside people he had once dismissed. He felt more accomplished than he ever had before. Robert Thompson clapped him on the back. "Not bad for your first day, Mr. Harris." He chuckled dryly. "Just call me Thomas." Robert smirked. "All right, Thomas. You coming back tomorrow?" Mr. Harris hesitated. His body screamed for rest. His pride urged him to say no. But his heart, the part of him he had silenced for so long, whispered something different. "Yeah, I think I am." Mark's face lit up with a rare smile. Lisa exchanged a knowing glance with Robert, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas Harris didn't feel like a man in control. He felt like a man who was finally learning lessons in work and worth. The next morning, Thomas found himself waking up at dawn, a time of day he usually reserved for reading the stock market reports with his coffee. Instead of his tailored suits, he put on an old pair of jeans and a t-shirt, feeling strangely unprepared for the day ahead. When he arrived at the construction site, the Thompson boys were already there, working diligently. Ethan was using a level to make sure the foundation markers were properly aligned. Noah was checking measurements against the blueprint. Jacob and Caleb were stacking materials, their little hands working quickly. Thomas observed them for a moment, amazed. "You boys sure know what you're doing." Ethan grinned. "Dad makes sure we do things the right way." Robert smirked as he approached, handing Thomas a pair of gloves. "No shortcuts here. Ready to work." Thomas slipped on the gloves, flexing his fingers. "I suppose we'll see." The day passed in a blur of labor. At first, Thomas struggled. His muscles weren't accustomed to physical exertion, and he moved slower than the others. But Robert was patient, teaching him step by step. "This isn't like managing properties, is it?" Robert joked as Thomas struggled to hammer in a nail straight. Thomas huffed. "Not even close." Lisa walked by carrying a stack of wooden planks, smiling. "You'll get the hang of it, Thomas. Hard work just takes practice." Thomas found himself laughing at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, learning from the very people he had once deemed not the right fit for his properties, and yet they had welcomed him in. That night, as they all sat on makeshift benches around a small fire, eating sandwiches and talking about the day, Thomas listened more than he spoke. He listened as Robert talked about his struggles, how hard it had been to start from nothing, how many doors had been shut in his face. He listened as Lisa described the sacrifices they had made, choosing to raise their boys with strong values rather than chasing wealth. He listened as the children spoke about their dreams. Ethan wanted to be a doctor. Noah wanted to be an engineer. Jacob wanted to be a writer. Caleb, the youngest, proudly declared, "I'm going to be an astronaut." Thomas chuckled. "That's quite a big dream." Caleb's little face scrunched in determination. Big dreams need big work. The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. And as he sat there, surrounded by a family he had once rejected, he realized something painful. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, controlling who belonged where. But sitting here, with dirt under his nails and sore muscles, he saw real wealth for the first time. It wasn't in money or properties. It was in family, in kindness, in resilience. And he had nearly let his prejudice rob him of witnessing it. A shift in perspective. The next few weeks changed Thomas Harris in ways he never expected. Each day, he returned to the build site. At first, the work was grueling, but soon, his body adapted. He became faster, more confident. But the real transformation was happening inside. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in charge. He wasn't making the rules, deciding who was worthy of something. Instead, he was learning, listening, growing. One afternoon, as they were framing the walls, he turned to Robert. "Why didn't you tell me who you were when Mark first started working for you?" Robert shrugged, hammering a nail into place. Would it have mattered? Thomas frowned. Robert glanced at him. "Would you have treated us differently?" The question burned, because deep down, Thomas knew the answer. Yes, he would have. And that realization was the hardest to swallow. "I was wrong about you," Thomas admitted, his voice low. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Robert paused for a moment, studying him. Then he nodded. "We all have things to unlearn." Thomas exhaled sharply. "I don't know if I can make up for what I did." Robert gave him a knowing smile. "Then don't try to erase it. Learn from it. Be better." Thomas nodded slowly, letting those words sink in. The unfinished letter. One evening, after another long day of work, Thomas sat in his study, staring at a blank sheet of paper. For years, he had signed contracts, written policies, and issued rejection letters without a second thought. But this letter, this was the hardest thing he had ever written. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I owe you both an apology." He stared at the words, his pen hovering over the page. How did he explain himself? How did he take back years of narrow-mindedness in a single letter? With a deep breath, he continued, "For too long, I have measured a person's worth by standards that I now see were flawed. I denied you a home not because of your finances, not because of your character, but because of a prejudice I refuse to acknowledge. I see now that I was wrong. I see now that my actions were not just about a house, but about who belongs. And I was blind to the fact that you, your family, belong everywhere that goodness, kindness, and strength reside. If you can find it in your hearts, I would like to meet with you, not as a landlord, not as a businessman, but as a man who is trying to change. Sincerely, Thomas Harris." His hands trembled as he signed his name. For the first time, Thomas Harris was doing something not out of power or control, but out of humility. And as he folded the letter, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about becoming a better man. A door opens. The next morning, Thomas Harris stood outside the Thompson family's rental home, gripping the letter tightly in his hand. His palms were clammy, and an unfamiliar nervousness gnawed at his stomach. He had closed many deals in his life, shaken hands with powerful executives, and made decisions that affected entire communities. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Lisa Thompson stood there, her expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. "Mr. Harris?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Thomas cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the envelope. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted, then hesitated. He had rehearsed this moment, but now that he was here, the words felt heavy on his tongue. Lisa studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Would you like to come in?" He exhaled, nodding. "Yes, thank you." As he stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth of the Thompson home. Though modest compared to his grand estate, it felt full of life, of love, of something Thomas couldn't quite name but invited nonetheless. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the air, and the walls were adorned with family photos, school achievements, and art drawn by the boys. It felt real. Lisa led him into the living room, where Robert was helping Caleb with a small wooden model house. At the sight of Thomas, Robert straightened, setting the project aside. "Mr. Harris," Robert greeted, his tone measured. Thomas felt the weight of his own shame settle onto his shoulders. He didn't deserve to be standing in this home. He had denied this family the chance to live in one of his properties, and yet here they were, offering him hospitality. Swallowing hard, he extended the envelope. I wrote this for you and your wife." Robert exchanged a glance with Lisa before taking the letter. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. The silence stretched. The sound of children's laughter echoed from another room, a stark contrast to the tension between the three adults. After a long moment, Robert let out a slow breath. "This is unexpected," he said finally. His voice wasn't angry, just wary. Lisa took the letter from him, reading over his shoulder. Her expression softened slightly, but there was still caution in her eyes. "We appreciate the apology, Mr. Harris," Lisa said gently. "But an apology is just words. What are you really here for?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. For so long, he had lived in a world where apologies smoothed things over, where wealth and power gave him an automatic second chance. But the Thompsons weren't looking for polished words or grand gestures. They'd wanted truth. Thomas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. I wanted to do something. I wanted to." He hesitated. "I wanted to try to make it right." Robert studied him. "And how do you plan to do that?" Thomas hesitated. He had thought about offering them one of his properties again, but something told him that wasn't the answer. Instead, he said something that surprised even himself. "I want to help you build your home." Lisa blinked. "You what?" Thomas let out a nervous chuckle. "Look, I may not be the best with a hammer, but I've been working with you these past few weeks, Robert. I see what you're doing, and I respect it." He paused. "If you'll have me, I'd like to keep helping." Robert's gaze was unreadable. "Why?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Because I need to learn. I spent years deciding who belonged where, who was the right fit. But I was wrong. You belong here, in any community, in any home. And if I can do something, anything, to make up for my mistake, I want to." For the first time in a long time, Thomas Harris didn't feel like the powerful businessman, the respected landlord. He felt like a man asking for a second chance. Robert was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "All right, Thomas," he said. "Let's see if you can keep up." Lisa's face softened. "Dinner's in an hour. You're welcome to stay." A lump formed in Thomas's throat. He wasn't sure why, but the offer felt significant, like a door opening. "Thank you," he said, and for the first time he meant it. More than just a house. From that day forward, Thomas Harris wasn't just a visitor, he was part of the team. He showed up early. He worked hard. He listened. The Thompson boys warmed up to him faster than he expected. Caleb, in particular, took a liking to him, following him around and asking endless questions. "Mr. Harris, do you know how to build a treehouse?" Caleb asked one afternoon as they measured the frame for the house's front porch. Thomas chuckled. "I think I can figure it out." "Promise." Caleb held out his pinky. Thomas hesitated, then linked his pinky with the little boy's. "Promise." As the weeks passed, the house began to take shape. The foundation was laid, the walls went up, and the roof was framed. And with each nail, each beam, each plank, Thomas Harris found pieces of himself being rebuilt too. One afternoon, as they secured the final wall panel in place, Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to Robert. "You know what," he said, "this house, it's more than just wood and nails. He struggled for the words. "It's a home," Robert finished for him, smiling. "Built with love." Thomas nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Yeah. For so long, he had defined success by wealth and exclusivity, by keeping certain people in and others out. But here, working with his hands beside the very people he had once rejected, he saw what truly mattered. It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It was family, community, and redemption. And as he looked at the home they were building, he realized something profound. He wasn't just helping to build a house. He was helping to build a future, one that, for the first time in his life, he was proud to be part of. Redemption in brick and wood. The house was more than halfway finished now, standing proudly against the horizon like a beacon of resilience. Thomas Harris ran his hand over the wooden frame, feeling the smoothness of the sanded planks, the strength in the beams. It was solid, sturdy, built with hands that had labored not just in construction, but in healing wounds invisible to the eye. It had been nearly a month since he had joined Robert Thompson's project, and every day had chipped away at the man he used to be. Each swing of the hammer, each plank he carried, Each nail he drove into place had reshaped not just the home before him, but the very foundation of who he was. He wasn't just a landlord anymore. He wasn't just the man who had once denied this family a place to live. He was Thomas, a man trying to change, to rebuild himself, one board at a time. The town whispers. Word of Thomas Harris's unexpected transformation spread fast through the town. The powerful, wealthy real estate mogul, who once turned people away with a cold flick of his wrist, was now hauling wood, hammering nails, and sweating alongside the very people he had once excluded. Some people admired him for it. Others were skeptical. At the local cafe, hushed conversations filled the air. Can you believe it? Thomas Harris, working with his hands. I'll bet it's just for show, trying to fix his reputation after that scandal at his company. I don't know. I saw him out there with the Thompsons. Looked real to me. Despite the whispers, Thomas kept his head down and worked. The opinions of the town didn't matter to him anymore. What mattered was earning the respect of the people who had every reason to doubt him. An unfinished invitation. One evening, as Thomas wiped down his hands after a long day of work, Robert approached him with an envelope. "This is for you," Robert said, handing it over. Thomas raised an eyebrow and opened it. Inside was a simple invitation. You are invited to the Thompson family's housewarming celebration. Date: 1 month from today. Location: our new home, built with love. Thomas's throat tightened. You don't have to come, Robert said, but we'd like you to. Thomas swallowed. Why? Robert smiled. Because you helped build it. Because despite everything, you've shown up. Because you're different now. Lisa appeared beside her husband, adding, and because forgiveness isn't just about saying the words. It's about choosing to move forward. Thomas looked down at the invitation, turning it over in his hands. For years, he had thrown extravagant parties, corporate galas, investor dinners, real estate summits filled with people who only valued status and wealth. But this was the first invitation that truly mattered. A face from the past. As the days passed, the house neared completion. One afternoon, Thomas was carrying a stack of bricks for the final touches on the exterior when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Didn't think I'd ever see you doing hard labor, Harris. Thomas turned, his stomach sinking. Standing before him was Richard Jameson, his former business partner, the man who had once shared his vision for an exclusive high-status community. Richard stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. So this is where you've been hiding, building houses instead of buying them. Thomas exhaled, setting the bricks down. What do you want, Richard? I came to see it for myself. The great Thomas Harris, reduced to a construction worker. Richard shook his head, chuckling. What happened to you? I woke up, Thomas said simply. Richard scoffed. Woke up? To what? That you don't belong here. He gestured toward the Thompsons' house. This isn't your world, Harris. You built a life in real estate, in business. Not in. He waved a dismissive hand. Whatever this is. Thomas clenched his jaw. This is a home, Richard. Something I used to think I understood. Richard's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. And what do you think you're proving here? That you're some kind of savior? Thomas's grip tightened around the gloves in his hands. I'm not trying to save anyone, he said, voice steady. I'm trying to be a better man. Richard's expression darkened. You're throwing everything away, Harris. For what? To impress some people who will never see you as one of them. Thomas took a deep breath. I don't need to be one of them, Richard. I just need to be better than I was. For a long moment, Richard stared at him, his mouth opening slightly as if searching for a response. But in the end, he just shook his head. Suit yourself, he muttered before turning and walking away. Thomas watched him go, feeling no anger, only relief. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't care about Richard's approval. A home with open doors. As the final touches were made on the Thompson house, the family stood outside, taking it all in. The walls stood strong, the windows gleamed in the sunlight, and the front porch, Thomas's favorite part of the build, looked warm and welcoming. Ethan grinned. It's finally done. Lisa wiped a tear from her eye. I can't believe it. Robert wrapped an arm around her. Believe it. We made this happen. Thomas stood a few feet away, watching. He had spent years denying families like this one a place in his world. And now he had helped them build one. Caleb ran up to him, tugging on his shirt. Mr. Harris, you promised me something. Thomas chuckled. Did I? The treehouse. Caleb bounced on his feet. Remember, you promised. Thomas smiled down at him. A promise is a promise, kid. Robert crossed his arms. You up for one more project, Thomas? Thomas smirked. Let's do it. As they laughed, standing before the house they had built together, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Something light, something free. He had spent a lifetime building walls. Now he was finally learning how to build bridges. 1 month later, the housewarming. The Thompson housewarming celebration was unlike anything Thomas had ever attended. There were no formal speeches, no investors in tailored suits, no velvet ropes separating people into categories of importance. Instead, there was laughter, food, music, and warmth. Neighbors gathered, children played in the yard, and the scent of home-cooked meals filled the air. And Thomas, he sat on the porch he had helped build, watching it all unfold with something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. Mark sat beside him, handing him a plate of food. Not bad, huh? Thomas shook his head, smiling. Not bad at all. Then, as if sensing the moment, Caleb ran up to them, pointing at the giant oak tree in the yard. Mr. Harris, time for the treehouse. Thomas chuckled, standing up and rolling his sleeves. All right, kid, he said, ruffling Caleb's hair. Let's build something amazing. And as they gathered their tools, laughter echoing around them, Thomas Harris knew. This wasn't just redemption. This was the beginning of something better, a new legacy. Thomas Harris stood beneath the towering oak tree, hammer in hand, as the sound of Caleb's excited giggles echoed through the crisp autumn air. The housewarming celebration had ended hours ago, but true to his promise, he had stayed behind to build the long-awaited treehouse. It wasn't about the structure itself, it was about trust, about proving to this little boy, to this family, and to himself that his word meant something. Do you think it'll be as strong as our house? Caleb asked, his tiny hands clutching the wooden frame as Thomas secured another beam. Thomas smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. If I have anything to do with it, this treehouse will last forever. Caleb grinned. Then I'm gonna live here when I'm big. Robert chuckled from where he stood beside the trunk, holding a toolbox. Don't get any ideas, son. Your mom's not gonna let you move out just yet. Lisa, who was watching from the porch with a warm smile, called out, As long as you don't bring your dirty shoes into the house, maybe we'll talk about it. The group laughed, and Thomas felt something deep in his chest shift. For years, his world had been about separation. His wealth had been a wall, his power a shield. He had drawn boundaries between himself and people like the Thompsons, convincing himself it was about maintaining order. But standing here, building something with his hands, surrounded by laughter instead of silence, warmth instead of status, he understood something he had refused to acknowledge before. Real success isn't about keeping people out. It's about bringing people in. Confronting the past. The following Monday, Thomas drove into town for a meeting he never thought he'd arrange. The building stood tall and pristine, its glass doors reflecting the city skyline. Harris and Jameson Realty. His former company, his empire, the place he had built from the ground up, only to be cast out when he changed. Stepping inside, he ignored the curious glances from former colleagues and made his way to the conference room. Richard Jameson sat at the head of the table, dressed in his signature pinstripe suit, an amused smirk on his face. I was wondering when you'd come crawling back, Richard mused, swirling a glass of bourbon in his hand. Thomas didn't rise to the bait. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. I'm not here to crawl, Richard. I'm here to correct a mistake. Richard's smirk faded. He leaned forward. What mistake? Thomas opened the folder, revealing property contracts, documents that included neighborhoods he had once controlled, homes he had once rejected families from. I want to buy back my shares in the company, Thomas said firmly, but not to run things the way I used to. Richard's eyes narrowed. And what exactly do you plan to do? Thomas met his gaze. I want to implement open housing policies. I want to create affordable housing in the communities we've neglected. I want to undo the damage we caused by keeping people out who deserved a fair shot. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've lost your mind. This company was built on exclusivity. You're talking about destroying everything we worked for. No, Thomas said, voice steady. I'm talking about fixing it. Richard leaned back, shaking his head. Even if I agreed, which I don't, you don't have the money to buy back in. Thomas slid another document across the table. A financial offer, a substantial one. Richard's smugness faltered. Where did you get this kind of money? Thomas smirked. Turns out, investing in people pays off. The truth was, after leaving Harris and Jameson, Thomas had quietly restructured his assets, selling off properties he no longer believed in and reinvesting in community-driven projects. It had taken time, but he had gathered enough capital to take back what was once his and change it for the better. Richard scoffed, rubbing his temples. And what if I say no? Thomas shrugged. Then I'll take my money elsewhere and build something better. But if you're smart, Richard, you'll realize that the world is changing. People don't want exclusion anymore. They want opportunity. For the first time, Richard didn't have a snide remark. He stared at the papers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled. You've really gone soft, haven't you? Thomas smiled. No, Richard. I've finally gotten stronger. A seat at the table. A month later, Thomas sat in a different office, one that felt nothing like his old one. Instead of glass walls and expensive furniture, this place was welcoming, community-driven, and real. He had partnered with organizations focused on fair housing initiatives, investing in projects that provided homes to families who had once been pushed aside, families like the Thompsons. And today, he wasn't sitting at the head of the table. He was sitting beside Robert Thompson. Robert flipped through a proposal, nodding approvingly. This is good, Thomas. Lisa, seated next to her husband, added, more than good. This is necessary. Mark, who had been quietly listening, grinned. Can't believe my dad is the guy leading a housing equality movement. Thomas chuckled. Believe me, son, neither can I. Robert leaned back in his chair. So what do we call this new venture of yours? Thomas thought for a moment, then smiled. The Open Doors Project, because that's what this was about. Not walls, not gates, not exclusivity, but opening doors for everyone. Robert extended a hand. Then let's open them together. Thomas shook it. This time, not as a businessman looking to close a deal, but as a man who had finally learned what truly mattered. The final nail. That evening, Thomas drove back to the Thompson home, no longer just a house, but a symbol of everything he had once been blind to. As he pulled up, he saw Caleb waiting outside, jumping excitedly. Mr. Harris, Mr. Harris. Thomas laughed, stepping out of the car. What is it, kid? Caleb grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the treehouse. We never put in the last nail. Thomas raised an eyebrow. The last nail. Caleb nodded vigorously. The last one is special. Dad says when you finish a house, the last nail seals the promise that it's a home. Thomas swallowed hard, nodding. All right then, let's do it. As they climbed into the treehouse, the golden glow of the setting sun bathed them in warm light. Caleb handed him a small, shiny nail, and Thomas took it carefully. "Go ahead," Robert called from below. "You earned this one." Thomas positioned the nail, and with a deep breath, hammered it into place. As the final thunk echoed through the treehouse, Caleb beamed. "Now it's really home." Thomas looked around. The treehouse, the Thompson home, the people below who had changed his life in ways he never expected. And for the first time in decades, he felt at peace. Because this wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about legacy. A new legacy, one built not on wealth, but on second chances, open doors, and the promise that everyone deserves a home. And as Caleb hugged him tightly, Thomas Harris finally understood. This was the life he was meant to build all along.